So I was following a Facebook post the other day and someone was asking about the difference between an SLX DC and a Curado DC, and several people were telling this person that they're the same, and they're simply not. So let's talk about the differences between the SLX DC and the Curado DC. First up, if you haven't bought one of these reels already, check out American Legacy Fishing. They have an outstanding lineup of Shimano products. They also have a great opportunity to trade in some of your gear and also buy used gear. And you may see my Curado DC there before too long, because I've been thinking about trading it in on a BFS reel. I would like to give that a shot. Let's talk about the price point between these two reels. That's probably one of the biggest factors for everybody. The SLX DC comes in at $190 retail, and the Curado DC comes in at $250. So there's a $60 price difference there. I'm gonna walk you through some of the differences between these two reels, and at the end of the day, you should be able to tell which one is right for you. Next up is going to be weight. The SLX comes in at 7.6 ounces and the Curado is 7.8 ounces. So they're both fairly close in weight. However, they're both fairly heavy compared to some of the other reels out there. The DC does add some weight to it. Next up is going to be line capacity. These are 150 size spools. They both will hold 12-pound line at 110 yards, perfectly adequate for whatever you want to do for long bomber casts, no problem. The drag on these two reels are both rated for 11 pounds. However, we'll get to it later, but the Curado has a cross-carbon drag system that you should be aware of. Let's touch on gear ratios. My SLX is actually an XT, it's an 8.2 to 1. My Curado DC is an HG, and that's a 7.4 to 1. But if we're going to compare HG to HG, the HG SLX is 7.2 to 1, and the Curado is 7.4 to 1. And the difference there is you're going to get 30 inches of line per revolution with the SLX HG and 31 inches with the Curado. No real difference there worth mentioning. Next up is going to be bearing count. The Shimano SLX has 4 bearings plus 1 roller, and then the Curado has 6 plus 1. And that's going to end up being a pretty big difference between these two reels. Let's go into the parts diagram and talk about where those bearings are at and why they make a difference. Starting with the SLX. So we're going to zoom in here at the spool. So we have the spool here. To the left of the spool is 1 bearing. To the right of the spool is the 2nd bearing. So we're up to 2 bearings. That's going to be common between these two reels. They both have the super free spool. They both have excellent quality spool bearings. No difference worth mentioning there. Next up, we're going to go up to the pinion gear. So the pinion gear is actually what's engaging with the spool, and that is actually doing the turning of the spool. Your hand is tied to the ring gear meshes with the pinion gear and turns the spool. So there's a lot of load going through that tiny little pinion gear. You'll notice on this SLX pinion gear, it's a little bit shorter than what I'll show you on the next one for the Curado, and that's going to play into the bearing count. Behind this pinion gear is 1 ball bearing, so that's good. And now we're up to 3 bearings. The last bearing is up here, and it's to the back side of the ring gear, and that's going to be shown here. So there's the 4 bearings in the SLX. That's going to be the big differences there. We're going to jump over to the Curado, and I'll show you where those 6 bearings are. Here is the Curado DC diagram. So again, this one has 6 bearings hiding in here. Spool, we have 1 bearing here and 1 bearing here. That makes up the 2 spool bearings, common with the SLX DC, no difference there. Next up, we have our pinion gear. So like I said on the previous one, this one you can see the little bits of the snout that's on the end of the pinion gear for the Curado. And what that's going to is this bearing here. So if you remember on the SLX, there was only 1 bearing over in this location, and this bearing number 3 is supporting the front side of the pinion gear. On the back side of the pinion gear, we still have a ball bearing like the SLX, and we're up to 4 bearings. The other 2 bearings are going to be associated with the ring gear drive. Here is our ring gear. This is what our hand is turning as we turn the handle. On the back side of that is 1 bearing, common with the SLX DC, and it actually has 2 bearings. That bearing number 6 here is on the other side of the ring gear. So if you're keeping up, we have the ring gear and the pinion gear are both supported by 2 bearings each. And that's what they're going to call the X-ship bearing system on the Curado, and that is not on the SLX. So those are all 6 bearings that are in the Curado. We're going to close it out here with a summary of the features and benefits between each reel. And starting off with the super free spool, we talked about that. It's a very high quality spool, very high quality spool bearings between the two. both exactly the same. They both have the SD3 spool, which is mitigating vibration in it, which anytime you have vibration, that's going to eat up efficiency and casting distance. Same thing there. The third one is going to be the IDC4 controller. That's the actual digital braking controller inside the unit. And that is common between the two. So you get the exact same controller in the SLX and the Curado. You line up all three of those things and you're going to get the exact same casting distance between these two reels. No difference. You can get an IDC5 in some higher end or newer Shimano reels, so there is a next gen there. And with that next generation, you get to not only adjust for the line type, but you adjust for the weight of the lure. So there's dual adjustment on the IDC5, which is going to be a little bit better in dialing it in. As far as casting goes on that IDC4, there's been some instances where I have to tweak with the spool tension above and beyond what the specification calls for to get it to keep from overrunning. It will do it with some baits. The spec for it, if you're not familiar with it, is to adjust the spool tension preload until the left and right slop, or the lateral slop, comes out of the spool and stop there. Like I mentioned, there's been some instances where I have to give it another quarter, half turn to get it to do exactly what I want, to get a little bit more tension on it. But I do use braid the leader, so maybe that's throwing it off on some instances, but overall it's worked out very well, especially if you use like the skipping function. That number 4 setting works fantastic. But do know there's a next generation out there, IDC5, that's not available today in the SLX or Curado DC. The last common feature between the two is the Hagane body. So it's similar in design and function. However, you'll notice the CI4 Plus on the Curado is giving you a higher carbon content body, and what that's going to do is going to add a little bit of mass, but it's going to get you some rigidity out of the Curado frame to help cut down on any distortion. I haven't noticed any real distortion in my SLX reel, but I should note that I don't use it for frogging or flipping or any deep diving crankbaits. If that's going to be more what you expect to use this reel for, there is an advantage to the Curado when it comes to that. Next up is the cross carbon drag. I touched on this back at the beginning. They're both rated for 11 pounds of drag, but if you're going to be really pushing it towards that 11 pounds, big fish pulling on it, you're going to get a little bit finer tuning adjustment out of the cross carbon drag on the Curado, and you'll get better high heat performance out of that drag in the Curado. So if you're really just not having to work your drag too much, SLX drag is fantastic. If you're going to really work it, again, coming back to the Curado being more intended for heavy loads, the Curado is going to perform better under those conditions. The X-ship is going to be the bearings that I talked about on the Curado. Those extra 2 bearings create the X-ship function there for the ring and pinion set. And what you're trying to do there is keep the best alignment between the ring and pinion gear when you load it down. Speaking of ring and pinion gear, the Curado has the micro module gear set, which is a finer tooth mesh, so it's going to be more efficient. You're going to feel smoother as you load down the reel. I keep harping on this because I want to make sure that you know that I feel that the Curado is a heavier duty reel over the SLX, and when you load it down, that's where you're going to start seeing those differences. And I'm not talking about loading it down and just reeling in a fish. I think both are fine for that. Loading it down when you're really grinding on it, if you will, deep diving crankbait kind of stuff where you're just you're putting all your horsepower through that reel trying to kill it, the Curado will do better. Last one there is going to be the shielded ball bearing shown by the S-ARB, and that's trying to keep dust, debris, salt, junk out of the bearings in the reel, and that's just going to help them last longer. So hopefully you understand there are some definite differences between these two reels. They are not the same. I hope you learned something there. I hope you found the video valuable. If you did, please leave me a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with more gear comparisons as well as bait techniques. And we'll see you next time.
Fish on. Thanks. Yep, there's a big one on there. Get him.
Get him.
Becca's got him. Get him back. Look at the size of that crappie. Oh, got him.
Oh, yeah.
Holy cow.
Oh, yeah.
Nice job, Becca.
Like, huh?
Look at the size of that crappie.
should take it to
We're gonna have to